and guidance and instructions and whatever else you want to do. The first one that I'm very, very, very excited about is this bill right here. This is H.R. 1. And when the Democrats are in charge or the Republicans are in charge, your first 10 bills kind of set forth your priority. Our priority as the Republicans, as the GOP in Congress, our priority is energy independence. So this is a bill to lower energy costs by increasing American energy production, exports, infrastructure, and critical minerals processing by promoting transparency, accountability, permitting, and production of American resources, and by improving water quality certification in energy projects and for other purposes. In this bill is my bill that I introduced called the Coal Act. And the purpose of the Coal Act is to require the Secretary of Interior to start issuing permits for coal production in all coal producing states, but obviously it would affect the state of Wyoming pretty dramatically. Cynthia Lummis is running this on the other side, on the Senate side, but that's a very important piece of legislation for Wyoming. The big thing about this is that all of the current environmental statutes stay in place, but it streamlines the process, and it also limits the amount of time that environmental groups can sue over these projects. I believe there's a statute of limitations in here that is 6 months. It also starts limiting what they can do in terms of the NEPA process. I always say that the process is the punishment anymore. That is how these things play out. This is to make sure that the intent of the environmental statutes is carried forward. We can protect our environment, but it stops the big business of suing and stopping these projects. And the ultimate goal is energy independence and to reduce the inflation we're seeing in this country. So H.R. 1, we just passed last week. It was a big, big deal. Week before last, I guess it was a week ago this past Thursday. Really big deal. Very, very excited about this. H.R. 5, another bill that we passed just 2 weeks ago, and H.R. 5 is the Parents' Bill of Rights. And that is where I don't want the federal government involved in education. If they're going to be involved in education, we all want to make sure that parents are actively involved in their kids' education. But it doesn't dictate anything, but it says it puts parents, not bureaucrats, back in charge of their children's education. Transparency and accountability for school districts so parents see what is being taught and have ample opportunities to interact with teachers. The right to know what's being taught in schools and to see reading material. The right to see school budgets and spending reports. The right to protect their child's privacy. And the right to be updated on any violent activity at their children's school. So a Parents' Bill of Rights, which are all common sense. You have to wonder, why in the world do we have to do legislation? And I'll tell you why. Because of some of the nonsense that's coming out of our schools right now. Keep in mind, I come from a long line of educators. My mom, my grandma, my sisters, my sister-in-laws. I love educators. I love teachers. But people who've been in this business for the last 30 to 40 years will tell you that education has changed so dramatically that they probably never would have gone into it if they knew what it was going to be like today. So some of the other bills, as you know, Joe Biden has tapped into the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, and it is now down over 40%. It is down over 40%. He's reduced it by over 40%. It is at the lowest point since 1984. But you want to know why it was at its lowest point in 1984? Because that's when they were filling it. It takes 9 years to fill our SPR. 9 years. And he was selling it to China. Yep. So we passed a bill that he could not sell, and again, we had over 100 Democrats. He cannot sell our SPR oil to China. So that passed. That's in the Senate now. The other thing that we're requiring for any president is if they're going to tap into the SPR, they actually have to declare what the emergency is and not failed energy policy. That's not an emergency. That's just failed energy policy, which is where we are with this president. And they have to have a plan of action to refill it. So that also had bipartisan support. We have done a resolution disapproving of the new Waters of the U.S. rule. Joe Biden vetoed that on Friday. He just vetoed that, or maybe it was today. but he vetoed that. We knew that that was a possibility, but we need people to understand that his WOTUS rule is not about protecting the water quality, but it's a land and water grab. We also, some of the others is I introduced a bill that directs the Secretary of Interior to remove the greater Yellowstone ecosystem population of grizzly bears from the federal list of endangered and threatened species. So I have done a bill that actually has bipartisan support, and the Fish and Wildlife Service has tried three times to delist the grizzly bear. We have over double the numbers of grizzly bears. The recovery goal was between 500 and 600, and we have over 1,000 grizzly bears in the greater Yellowstone area. So there's also a risk to the grizzly bear itself if we don't start managing it. It will be managed pursuant to Wyoming's grizzly management plan, so we will be able to protect a recovered grizzly population even if they are delisted. But that is one that was introduced, that I introduced. Also, Protection of Women and Girls in Sports Act, the Stop CRT Act, an educational choice bill so that people can choose where to educate their children, protect our livestock and farmers from the SEC rule. As you know, the SEC rule, they're attempting to force all of our banks and our financial institutions to identify the carbon footprint of anyone that they interact with. And so for our livestock producers and others, they're trying to essentially force our livestock producers out of business with the paperwork that they would have to fill out. Defund EcoHealth Alliance. You know who EcoHealth Alliance is? That's the company that received the millions of dollars that were doing the gain of function research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. They're still getting millions of dollars from the NIH. And so we have introduced a bill to stop them from receiving any additional funding. And those are just some of them. There's a lot of other things that I have either voted for, co-sponsored, or that I am the original sponsor of. We'll probably talk about some of those as I answer your questions. That kind of gives you an overview of what we've been doing so far in the last 4 months. But I wanted to get back out to the people of Wyoming and give you a full report and also hear from you as to the priorities that you have and give you an update of where we're probably going, some of the things that we'll be doing over the next couple of months. We're going to have to do our budget. One of the other things that we agreed to with the speaker vote was, for the first time in a long time, we're going to follow the actual budgeting process. So there are 12 appropriation bills that are put together that then become the budget of the House of Representatives. And so it will be looking at defense spending, and it will look at domestic spending, and it will look at all of that. And those 12 bills are being put together right now by the various committees of jurisdiction. And we're going to start meeting with the whip and the leadership to talk about what our priorities are for budgeting. For me, a lot of it comes back to we've got to stop funding these agencies to the extent that they're being funded. One of the things I often talk about is that we're $32 trillion in debt. We're the largest debtor nation in U.S. history. But not only is the number bad, they've covered up a lot of really bad policies with deficit spending. If they had to stay within a budget, they never have to choose between two bad ideas. Maybe we could come up with a bill that whenever they have two bad ideas, they can only pick one. Because right now, they can fund every bad idea that they come up with, and they do, because they just print money. They print more and more and more money. And so that's something that we have got to get a handle on. That's why I am primarily looking at trying to find ways of cutting programs. The RFID ear tag being one, education. I just read, I think it's the Department of Education has $87 billion. I mean, it's such a mind-boggling number, it doesn't even make sense at this point. So those are going to be priorities for me, is we're going to have to find a way to cut the discretionary spending. And what that also does is it's not just cutting spending for the sake of cutting spending. Congress needs to take back its rightful role. We should not be allowing bureaucrats who are unaccountable to us make all the decisions that destroy our lives. And it's just, for me, that simple. You should be making the decisions here in Wyoming. You're the legislator. You're the person who gets to make those decisions and be held accountable by every single person in this room. When they're making the decisions that tie your hands back in DC, it's disenfranchising to everyone. So with that, I'd like to just open it up to questions. Yes, are you pressed?
Yes, I am.
Okay, can we wait until afterwards, and that way I can answer questions for everybody, and then I'll sit down with you for a minute and answer some of your questions at the end. Okay. Yes, right here.
Yes, ma'am. With the de-dollarization efforts that are going on and the rise of the petrodollar, the first contracts for energy being sold recently negotiated under the petro yuan, do you believe that we have the capability to overcome our budget woes at the same time that we're devaluing the dollar as compared to world currencies?
No, it scares me to death. And one of the things that I want to do when we get back to Washington, D.C., is we're going to have to sit down as a conference and figure out what we're going to do to try to address this. So one of the things that happened very early in January was there was a gentleman from OMB came and spoke to us. So I'm on I'm in a conservative caucus. And they invited a gentleman from OMB, Office of Management and Budget. And he spent a good half an hour, 40 minutes, telling us about how financially dire the situation is. And so I raised my hand and I said, at any time in history, are there other countries who have been in this kind of a fiscal crisis? And prior to going to OMB, he had been a professor, I believe it was at Princeton, I could be wrong, but he had been a professor of world economic history. So he had some of that information at his fingertips, and he said, yes, and he said for those countries who actually fundamentally changed what they were doing, they were able to survive it. And for those countries who did not, they're failed states. So my follow-up question was, well, which is which? Yeah. And he said Canada and Israel both pulled out of their death spiral. But they did it by cutting a lot, and then also they have a pretty good trading partner in the United States of America, right? But the failed states are Greece and Argentina, and you've got an awful lot of failed states in Africa. But he said we have to change, fundamentally we have to change what we're doing in this country. And then I went and I met with the Vice President Pence, and I was talking to him, and he said, well, New Zealand is another country that survived. They cut everything by 20%. Across the board, they just cut everything by 20%. Didn't matter what the program was. They went through some real serious pains. But the reason that we have been able to do and sustain the debt that we have for as long is we're the world currency.
Right, and we are soon approaching no longer being the world.
And that's where I need to sit down with the Stephen Moores of the world and the economists and find out what happens when we're displaced. Because just this last week, massive inflation. We're going to see serious financial crisis, much more than we have ever seen probably in the history of this country, if China is successful in displacing us as the world currency. We're not there.
Right.
We're not there. I don't want people to think that we're there, but they're definitely rattling the sabers, which means we have got to get our house in order. I do find it very interesting that the president of France went begging to China, not the United States. And he's in the throes of a mess because he tried to do just even a very little bit of pension reform, raising the retirement age from 62 to 64, and they've had 3 weeks of riots. So he went to China for a reason, and I'm sure it is to backstop him and try to find a way to get some money into that country. I don't know if they would refer to it as the Belt and Road Program, but that's the reality of probably what China's doing. But it scares me that the president of France has now come out and basically thrown the United States and Taiwan under the bus by saying that he's essentially aligning with China. That's an incredibly dangerous development. But I'm not an economist. I need to learn more about it too. I'm just trying to read as much as I can to understand the implications of it.
Thank you.
I know there's one here, and then I'll get back to you guys back there.
What can we do to stop China from buying all of our industry and all that stuff? Because what's happening is they're going from inside and they're working their way out.
Yes. So right now, China owns one of our 4 packers.
Yep.
And 2 are owned by Brazil, 1 American, one China. 2 of the bills that I have co-sponsored are to prevent China from purchasing any more farmland in the United States. And another one is to prevent certain countries from buying sensitive areas. And those countries include China, North Korea, Venezuela, Iran, Russia. I don't know if Saudi Arabia is on that list or not. But we have identified, and I believe, again, both of those bills had bipartisan support. But they have now gone to, have they come up, Troy? Both the bills to stop China from purchasing, have they been voted on yet?
Some haven't been voted on independently, but some came through HR 1 and were tacked on as
Okay, they were part of HR 1. Couldn't remember how we did that. We're doing it through legislation. We're trying to stop that. Then what we need to figure out is if we're successful in getting these through, how do we reverse? I can't go to China and buy land. But I also want people to know we're not just talking about the Chinese Communist Party, we're talking about anybody affiliated with it. So they can't use a surrogate to purchase it if they can't purchase it directly. So what that will entail and how to enforce that may get a bit complicated, but it's a step in the right direction to make sure that we can continue to protect our means to grow food. We don't want to be food dependent. I know our government's pushing us that direction. We got to fight that with everything we have. But so that's what we're doing. I believe that gentleman right back there. Yes.
Do you have there any pro-life or pro-family bills that you've supported?
Yes, there are several that I have. Born Alive Act, the Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act, and a resolution expressing the sense of Congress condemning the recent attacks on pro-life facilities, groups, and churches. What I was surprised about with both of these is we did not get any Democrat support. And I'm being very sincere when I say that. When a baby's born, I don't know why you wouldn't give it care. But we did not get support for that one. So yes, we have done several pro-life bills. Where I am coming from to a certain extent is when the Supreme Court returned that to the states where it belongs. Again, I want to get as much power and authority out of Washington, D.C., and not have everything be a federal issue. I want our states to be addressing these things because I think that that's where a lot of this stuff should be addressed. I'm very pro-life, and these are 2 bills that have come across so far. But I also want to make sure that we try to take as much power as we possibly can from Washington, D.C., and bring it to the states where it belongs.
Okay, and one of our senators voted to repeal the DOMA, the Defense of Marriage Act. Yeah, is there any other bills that, like, to replace that or try to do something to...
I am terribly worried about what the outcome of that bill is going to be, because that was signed by the president. That went through the House. My predecessor voted the same way that our senator did. So they both voted for that. I think that it is, I think that one of my staffers put it best, which was that bill did not legalize gay marriage. That had been legalized by the U.S. Supreme Court. It made anyone who disagrees with gay marriage, it outlawed their beliefs. And I think that's probably the most succinct way of putting it. It didn't legalize gay marriage, it made opposition to it illegal. And I worry about that, and when I watch the degradation of our society and our culture, I'm looking at what is happening. If you had told me 5 years ago we would be talking about mutilating kids, I'd say you're crazy. And yet we're talking about mutilating kids and mutilating adults. We have gone so far beyond some the statements of, you know, love is love, to if you don't agree with us, you're going to be prohibited from engaging in the public square. And that's why these bills are so incredibly dangerous. That bill has gone through, and they did that before the new Congress took over. They did that before the Republicans took over in the House. They did 2 things in December that were very destructive. One was the $1.7 trillion omnibus spending bill, which stripped us from being able to use the power of the purse until we do our budget this year, which won't go into effect until September, and that one. And they did it intentionally because they knew that the conservatives had retaken the House. So I wish I had better news for you on that, but I don't. We have to keep fighting it culturally within our communities, and we need to stand up for what is right. I'll come back to you, but I want to make sure I get around to everybody first. Sir?
Yes, I spoke to you before. Excuse me, I fall down. I'd like to either thank you or damn you for turning me on to reading Julie Kelly.
Julie Kelly is very good.
She's quite good. I'm quite concerned about the January 6th stuff, and it's not being addressed very well, I don't think. They turned loose a little bit of tape, and then it just kind of went away. One question I have, any of the judges there that are denying rights, can they be removed?
They could be impeached.
Okay.
And so I have been horrified. One of the things that I have said repeatedly is that anybody who broke the law should be prosecuted for breaking the law, and they should be treated like anybody else for breaking the law in the same way. It's clear that this is political persecution that we are witnessing. It is a violation of Fourth Amendment rights. It's a violation of the Sixth Amendment, the Eighth Amendment, the law against cruel and unusual punishment. I am horrified to say that I'm part of the legal profession when looking at what has happened with the January 6th prisoners. And every day it just seems to get worse. We're limited. There is a separation of powers. That is judiciary. Every one of those cases should have been removed to a different venue. What is happening with President Trump in New York? That's a totally trash case. We know it's a trash case. We know that it's solely for purposes of trying to destroy him and prevent him from running for election or re-election. And so we have to figure out what are the avenues that Congress has to try to address it. But here's the other problem. We have one house, or we have one half of one branch of government. We've got to retake the Senate. We have got to retake the White House. But I will also tell you that some of the things that we are doing with the Select Committee on the Weaponization of the Federal Government and the Judiciary Committee is looking at ways in which the FBI, DOJ, and those agencies have been weaponized against American citizens. So we're getting some of it, but pulling things out of these agencies is worse than pulling teeth. You know, it's a subpoena. You write a letter, and then they ignore you. And then you write a second letter, and then they ignore you. And then you subpoena them. And then they come in and try to negotiate what they're going to bring. And then you get another subpoena. And eventually you get some information. So 2 weeks ago, 10 days ago, on Thursday, a week ago this past Thursday again, what was it that Comer from the Oversight Committee announced? Do you all remember? He announced that they had found substantial documentary evidence that the Biden family had received millions of dollars from the Chinese Communist Party.
What a shock.
That was 10 days ago. What leaked that same day? The indictment of Donald Trump. That's the only thing that they will talk about. That's the challenge that we have. It's why I think town halls like this, I'm hoping all my counterparts are doing the same. I come to Wyoming, but they need to do it in Texas and in Montana and Kansas, because a lot of people don't know this. I mean, it takes you a minute. Probably the biggest revelation of corruption was to find out that the Bidens have received millions of dollars directly from the Chinese Communist Party. And 10 days later, we're not even talking about it anymore. Because our legal system has been weaponized against us too. Not just the January 6th prisoners. They're the ones suffering it, but the point is to make sure that we're all scared of our government. And that's what we can't be. We can't be scared of our government. We have to be willing to push back. And that's why I'm willing to go out and say what I think needs to be said. So it's a tragedy. It is truly a tragedy. Yes, sir.
So you mentioned the Department of Education, but another agency that's direct infringement of rights is the ATF. Do you have any way of limiting the ATF?
We have filed a Congressional Review Act resolution to stop the pistol brace, to stop that from being able to go into effect. We may very well have some bipartisan or bicameral support for that in the Senate, because John Tester's running for re-election, as is Joe Manchin. So I don't think they've taken that up yet. Have they, Troy? They haven't taken that one up yet. We'll see. You know, what's happening with the Senate right now is that there are quite a few Democrats that are out. Dianne Feinstein is out, Fetterman is out, and what's his name, Blumenthal, just broke his leg yesterday. And so they are not, they don't have a majority, so they're not voting on a lot of stuff because I know, and that's a good thing. And I agree that it's a good thing, but see, they don't really have a working majority right now, so they haven't taken that one up. Also, I handled the bump stock case with my law firm. You know, the ATF several years ago determined that bump stocks should be declared as machine guns. I represented a gentleman out of Texas by the name of Cargill. It was Cargill versus ATF. And we challenged that they did not have the agency ATF did not have the legal authority to impose or to declare that the bump stock was a machine gun. And the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals en banc about a month ago ruled in our favor and concluded the same way. And so I do know that there have been lawsuits filed in Texas against the pistol brace. And then just this last week, did somebody file a bill to abolish the ATF? Yeah, I signed on to that one. So, yeah, we're there. Again, you know, that's not getting through the Senate right now, but what I'm telling you is that the people in the House are very, very, very pro-Second Amendment. Very strong constitutionalists. A lot of my freshman class, we have quite a few veterans. And they are, we've got some great, good people, really great people in there. And that's something that's on all of our radar. All of our radar. Yes, sir.
Thank you, ma'am. I served 24 years in the Marine Corps.
Good for you, thank you.
And then I served another 10 years with the Marine Corps. And I was up in the Joint Staff. I worked with Congress critters, and I know how not very intelligent many of them are, especially on foreign affairs. So when you're talking Belt and Road, I understand all that. The first question I have is, at the very beginning of this, you were talking about a bipartisan bill with the against the CCP, and you said that President Trump will sign it. That's what you said.
Which one was it? Oh, the SPR? Did it have to do with the?
No, it was before that. It was right after you introduced, you said hello, and you started. Remember what you said?
Yes, I think you misspoke.
I think
you might say
You meant President
President
Biden.
Biden, I hope.
What did I say?
You said President Trump.
You said
Oh, I'm
President
sorry,
Trump.
just wishful thinking. I'm
Wishful
sorry.
thinking.
I'm sorry.
The next
Sorry.
thing is,
I thought maybe you knew something we didn't.
yeah, I was hoping. I was hoping.
No,
The other
sorry.
one, on the Indians. Okay, I'm an Indian. I know I don't look like it, but I'm a member of the Chickasaw tribe. We are incredibly successful.
Boy,
I recommend you get Tubby in there and ask him how he made it so successful, because we get so much money from
so
all you people.
what are your resources? Because one of-
ourselves.
Okay.
Ourselves.
Because one of the things that we've had some tribes come in that are highly successful. The Seminole tribe in Florida, second largest cattle producer in the state. And Florida is one of our top cattle producers in the nation.
One of our nations.
Yeah. In New Mexico, we brought in several tribes to talk about the importance of oil and gas and mining development. So
But we don't have a reservation.
Oh, you don't? Okay.
No, but we're incredibly successful.
And not all of them do, because they've gone out and bought their own assets. And that's why we want to clarify and make sure that to the extent that they have these assets, they don't necessarily have a reservation, but they own a bunch of oil and gas leases in the Gulf of Mexico, is an example of some of the things they've done. We want to make sure that they can continue to have the autonomy to manage those without the Secretary of Interior telling them what they can and cannot do.
So I recommend you ask my chief, Tubby.
Would you do me a favor?
Yeah.
Before we leave, Troy will give you a business card.
Yeah.
Email him with that information, and to the extent we have additional hearings on that, we will invite him.
The last thing I don't want to do is having worked on the Joint Staff for a long time, Middle East specialist. I reckon, and you mentioned it about declassifying a lot of records. One of the huge issues in the federal government, especially having come out of DIA and working with CIA and NSA, is overclassification.
Overclassification.
I remember sending emails, and you just ask, hey, you want to go for lunch? Secret no form.
No, I know, and that's the battle that we have.
But nobody will talk. Nobody, I mean, there has to be a committee that's just cut. I mean, 90% of all that traffic is unclassified.
So, what we have is a lot of whistleblowers. All right?
Protect them.
So, that's right. And there are some of them that there is starting to be a threat that they're going to be exposed, and that is coming from some of the current federal employees. It's almost as though they're giving a threat. We have had, Jim Jordan has talked about it quite a bit on TV. There have been massive numbers of whistleblowers coming forward to the various committees, trying to explain what is going on. Very heavy from my standpoint, because these are the committees I'm on, FBI, DOJ, those kinds of agencies. We do need to protect them. I agree with you, we've got to protect them. There are some changes to the civil service rules that the administration has tried to put in place, where when they're doing their training about whistleblowing, they're doing the training at the same time of what can happen if they disclose any kind of evidence that is supposed to be regarded as confidential or classified.
Yeah.
So it's very clearly a threat. When you come in for your training, we're telling you, yeah, you can be a whistleblower, this is how you do it on this hand, but over here, if you do it, we're gonna prosecute you for exposing classified information. So it's clear what the administration is doing, and the threats are very obvious. We're trying to navigate all that because we don't wanna put somebody in a difficult position. But I agree with you, they overclassify.
You need to get rid of the chairman and SecDef. I briefed Austin when he was a brigadier general. He's dumb as a box of rocks.
Yes, he is.
He is.
I agree with you.
He'll do whatever
I've watched him on TV, and I've been horrified.
I mean, 2003, we were in Afghanistan, and he asked, "Who's Al Qaeda?" I'm like, "That's why we're here." And I wanted to tell him right there. And all the Army staff said, "Sit down, Marine. We'll tell him later." So they never did.
This won't. Everybody just needs Joe Biden's
Thank you.
courage. That's all.
All right. Right back here, then I'll come to you.
Thank you. Have you had anything to do with the cool?
I have in the past, the country of origin labeling. It's one of the things that we keep pushing back on the RFID stuff. Why do we have to trace every single animal using RFID and what amounts to surveillance, which is what it is? Because part of the RFID is you have to register your ranch with you have to register your ranch with the federal government. But we can't get country of origin labeling. You go into a grocery store and you look at lamb, look at pork, look at the others. They do country of origin labeling. They won't do it for beef. And we had it, and the World Trade Organization came out and said it violated whatever the WTO was pushing, and we repealed it. Our representative and senator from Nebraska repealed country of origin labeling. It's something that we need to push forward with again. I don't know, Troy, if there's possibly someone who is pushing forward with that. If not, it's something we'll get on our priority, but USDA and the Packers block us and they fight with us. They fight us every time. But especially where we are right now in terms of food security and insecurity, I think it's absolutely desperate that we get cool back in place. I do.
And I agree with you on the water. I think every drop of rain that falls in Wyoming should be used at least twice before it goes to Montana.
Well, and that's up here. I will tell you, because of irrigation, so we had a hearing on water infrastructure a couple of weeks ago, and there's a representative from California who has always been the expert on water in Congress. He's a Democrat. And there was a woman there testifying about how we have to take out all the dams. And we shouldn't have water storage. So I'm towards the end of the questioning because I'm a lowly freshman, so I have to wait for everybody else. But there are advantages to that because you kind of get to back cleanup and see what everybody else has done. So I started explaining to them that in the interior West, you don't have live streams later in the summer if you don't have irrigation. I talked to them about return flows. I talked to them about the Miracle Mile. I said, does anybody on this panel know where the Miracle Mile is? And they all said no. And I said, it's in central Wyoming. And it's the #1 blue ribbon fishery in North America. Do you want to know why? Because there's 3 reservoirs upstream, and we can keep 500 CFS in that river year-round. That's why it's the Miracle Mile. I talked about the importance of irrigation. In the North Platte River, and I don't know what the rule of thumb is here, but I could figure it out. In the North Platte River, we use and reuse that water 7 times between when it comes into Wyoming in Colorado and when it leaves Wyoming into Nebraska. We use and reuse that water 7 times because of irrigation, deep percolation, runoff, keeping our streams live, our reservoirs built 100 years ago, and we're able to keep bare appropriators irrigating into September because of irrigation. And so many people don't understand that relationship. They don't understand it, but it is critical that we start educating. And that's what I used my opportunity to do. I said, you guys don't know anything about irrigation. You don't know about water. And you know what? That guy from California shut up and never said another word. And so did the woman, because she kept, she wants to talk about our sick rivers. And no, my great-grandfather came to Wyoming in 1879, and he wrote a lot. He was a writer. And he talked about the fact that we didn't have fisheries in Wyoming except in the mountains, because our streams dried up later in the stream. The North Platte River dried up every single year. Every single year. It was dry by September until we built storage. It is imperative that people understand that, but most people don't. So, yes, right here.
We have a local whistleblower that I was just made aware of yesterday when I was visiting my son in Worland. They homeschool, so they're a little bit insulated from the local stuff, but a teacher there is whistleblowing and has resigned his position, Tom Herndon, and one of the points of contention that he's bringing is that he argued with his department head that you can't teach U.S. history without studying the Revolutionary War, and they have adopted a curriculum that eliminates that from part of their high school curriculum in Worland, our beloved next door neighbors. And so I thought that was an appropriate subject for our community to be able to be aware of.
Our history and our foundation and our founding is critical to understanding who we are and why we have the culture that we have, and why freedom was at the forefront of the people who wrote that Declaration of Independence and Constitution, and why they saw the individual as being what we protect, not collectivism. Why they believed that the individual and family and community being the center of the universe rather than government being the center of the universe. And I don't know how you teach our Constitution, our Bill of Rights, which discusses our natural rights being God-given. I don't know how you understand all of that if you don't understand the intellects that wrote those documents that focused on limiting government, limiting power, giving power, not giving, recognizing the power innate in every one of us the moment that we are conceived. If you don't understand that, you're not going to be able to defend the type of government that we have. And so I believe that history is absolutely the foundation of being able to teach. I mean, they say it all the time. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. I mean, there are so many sayings that talk about history being critical to being able to move forward in the human condition, to advance your society. You have to know what came before, or you're never going to know where you're going. And I think that that's sad, but again, the educators in my family would tell you that the focus on education has changed over time. It's changed over time, and we need to get back to the basics.
Thank you.
We really do. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so it doesn't just seem to me, it's an actual fact. I mean, you're talking about him vetoing the CFR that you guys did for the WOTUS, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whose job, which arm of the government's job is it to impeach Joe Biden?
Us.
Do it.
Okay. What I would say about that is that I have signed on to pursuing articles of impeachment against Mayorkas. The other thing I will say is I don't know what the status of what you just said is in DC. When I get back there next week, I will be returning to DC on Monday.
Look what he's done with the oil, what you talked about the oil.
I agree.
I can imagine, I can just envision him doing exactly what Macron is doing right now with us. Oh, well, we're going to align with China. He is already aligned.
He's already aligned with China.
So that could happen to us. He's got to go.
He's already aligned with the Chinese Communist Party. The Senate isn't going to convict him.
It's your job to start it.
I agree.
Then you get Harris.
I agree.
Chairman of Joint Chiefs.
So I don't disagree with you. So one of the things that we did as a Judiciary Committee is we held a field hearing in Yuma, Arizona to look at the border, to see what was going on in the border. And the first night we were there, we went out at 12:30 at night and went to the border wall in a couple of different places. And then in one location, we were standing where there's about a 50-foot gap in the wall. And the equipment is still there. So the backhoes, the heavy equipment, it's been sitting there for 2 years and 4 months in exactly the same place it was on January 20th, 2021. All of the materials are laying on the ground right there, millions of dollars worth of equipment and materials. And we came to a 50-foot gap in the wall, and as you may imagine, that's a hot spot, they told us. I think anybody could have figured that out. But one of the things that they said was that they have found over 200 bodies just on the other side of that area. You can't cross the border unless you go through the cartels. They will kill you. They have made over $11 billion in 2 years in human trafficking.
Who's being paid on this side by them?
Pardon me?
Who's being paid on this side by them?
A lot of people.
Exactly.
A lot of people. Just even looking at a young woman got picked up yesterday with 8 illegals in the back of her vehicle. She was a resident of one of the border communities, an American citizen. $11 billion, but here's what's important. Not all of that is important, but they have price lists, and they charge, $50,000 if you're from China, or $25,000 if you're from India, or $8,000 if you're from Guatemala, whatever it is. They have price lists, actual price lists. They wear bracelets. They're color coded. They're color coded when they come across the border, but they don't pay that in cash. They pay a portion of it in cash, and then they have to work it off by human smuggling, human trafficking, sex trafficking, or drug smuggling. So that's why you're seeing them, and it's the NGOs that are shoving them into Boston and Billings and Denver and Kansas City and LA and Idaho. They are going to where they need to go to carry out the work of the cartels. And our government, Joe Biden is the largest human trafficker in U.S. history, the largest drug smuggler in U.S. history. Yes, sir?
I was at a meeting with Mark Gordon one time, and I asked about illegals coming to Wyoming, and he said, well, you couldn't fly them in. And I wasn't thinking at the moment, but I tried to find out since how many have been bussed into Wyoming, and you cannot find that statistic. Wyoming doesn't tell you how many illegals they estimate have come here. It bothers me that Wyoming won't report that.
So there's a couple of things that I learned. So I asked the question, why? So when you go there, they line up, and there are processing centers right on the border. And they line up, and they take them by buses into tent cities. And then they process them there. And I said, it used to be that illegal aliens ran. Why are they waiting? And the reason they're waiting to be picked up is they're getting work permits. Mm-hmm. If they come in on an asylum claim, they can get a work permit. So the other thing is that Yuma produces a lot of our food that is used for human consumption. Celery, broccoli, cauliflower. At times a year, certain times a year, 70% of the food that we consume comes from Yuma, Arizona. Their farming and infrastructure is fabulous. I wanted to go tour the water systems, but I didn't get to do that. But we met with quite a few producers down there, and they were in tears. And their fields run right up to the wall, right up to the border, and they're overseen not by USDA but by the FDA. And if there is a footprint in their field, they have to destroy the crops in a 5-foot radius. So as those illegal aliens come through their fields, they are having to destroy entire fields of fresh produce because of the way that the FDA requires them to monitor. They have to do inspections every day. They're beside themselves. They don't know that they're even going to survive. So it's a terribly tragic situation that we're dealing with, and you can't figure out why they do it. Over 10 times the population of Wyoming has come into the United States illegally in the last 2 years, over 5 million people.
Do you know how many have come into Wyoming?
I don't know how many, but we'll make a note of that and see if we can find that out. We'll make a note and see if we can find that out. So I keep asking housing organizations. You know, there's a lot of different housing organizations who've come to meet with me and they want federal funding for low-income housing. And the question I ask them is, to what extent is illegal immigration affecting the housing industry in our country? You wanna know what their response is? Oh, not at all. I don't believe that one. Sorry, not gonna believe that one. What that tells me whether I'm gonna support their demand, their request or not. If you're not going to admit that adding 5 million people into some of these communities, if you're not going to admit that that has an effect on housing, then you're part of the problem. It's got an effect on the housing. It's got a huge effect on the housing. It's got a huge effect on our wages. It's suppressing wages in this country. It's affecting our middle class. It's affecting our working families. It's having a devastating impact on every single metric you could come up with. And the tragedy, I mean, they pointed out the rape tree. They have it. They do it. That's one of the last things the women go through before they come across that border. And our government's doing it. Our government's doing it. Our government's complicit in it.
President Biden admitted that too many corporations were hiring children for the factories. What happened to our child labor laws?
That is something that I think is going to have an impact on this, because that's exactly part of what is happening, is that you're seeing these, because they have to pay off. You're seeing a lot of child labor in areas that you didn't used to see because we had the child labor laws. There are a couple of things that I'm hoping are going to blow this out of the water so we can try to get some kind of operational control over our borders. It's just not happening right now. So, any other questions? Right here, and then I'll come back.
There, besides the things you've already mentioned, there's 3 other topics that I've been really thinking about. One is the CBDC. The other is the infrastructure that Trump was working on for our energy, so that, you know, if we were to have an EMP or something, that our country wouldn't be wiped out. And the third is voter integrity. I mean, I think all those kind of go together, and I'm really concerned that I don't know that we can actually have a really honest election. I had thought Wyoming was kind of immune, and these ladies got to go to a talk. Do you remember the doctor's name?
Frank.
Dr. Frank. And he demonstrated that all of our machines, they don't hook to the internet, but they hook to cell towers, and they absolutely can real time manipulate those.
I don't need a modem to hook to the internet.
Okay.
So
say the first one again.
So CBDC, the centralized, the digital
box. Currency.
Yeah.
Okay, should scare all of us. But I don't believe that Joe Biden can do that without Congress. He can't change our currency without laws in place. I know they try to do everything regulatorily. I do. And what I'll also say is, just like with the waters of the U.S. rule, I believe that the Supreme Court is going to substantially constrain the power of the EPA. The decision was, the argument was made in the Sackett case in October. We should be getting a decision by the end of June. I do believe that the waters of the U.S. rule is most likely not going to go anywhere. Now, I could be totally wrong, but I believe that the Supreme Court is going to constrain that. I do not believe it is even remotely possible for him to put in place digital currency without Congress, which is why we have to hold on to the House, get the Senate, take back the White House, because we can't let it happen. Because at that point, we're Canada. They'll do to us exactly what they did to the truckers, which is they will cut off our access to cash and money the moment that we do something that is outside of what they want us to do.
Social credit score.
It is absolutely social credit score. Your second issue.
I'm concerned about infrastructure, especially.
I am concerned about infrastructure as well. One of the things that is so troublesome is about how dishonest Congress is. The infrastructure bill is anything but. Less than 30% of the funding related to that $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill actually goes to hard infrastructure, and most of it is not what we want. It is things like electric vehicle charging stations. It's not going in and rehabilitating our Buffalo Bill Reservoir or Seminole Reservoir and that kind of thing. For me, infrastructure, and I do want federal funding for infrastructure of these big projects in our highways. That's what our federal government should be doing, not all the other stuff, but that kind of stuff. But less than 30%, some people say less than 10. I gave them the benefit of the doubt. I actually looked through that and was able to find, yeah, that could potentially be considered infrastructure. And for me, it came up to like 27, 28% of that infrastructure. So our infrastructure is crumbling in a lot of places. California, most specifically, that's why they've got such an issue with their water infrastructure. They have about the same water infrastructure in place today with 40 million people as they had in the 60s with 16 million people. That's why they keep stealing water. That's why Lake Mead and Lake Powell are struggling. It isn't, the drought has an impact, no doubt, but they're also stealing water. And then your last one was election integrity. I am also concerned about election integrity. I'm not as concerned about Wyoming as, and I understand that there are the concerns that they have. What I do want to tell you is you don't want the federal government fixing this because you don't want the federal government involved in elections. That's the last thing that you want. What you do need to do is continue to raise these issues with our Secretary of State and our governor, demand that they address the issues that you have raised, but there's other things that need to be done. We needed to pass a bill so that we don't get Zuckerberg money in our elections. Zuckerberg put in over $500 million in the 2020 election, the purpose of which was get out the Democrat vote campaign. That's what it was. 95% of that money went to Democrat counties, 95% of it. Yeah, he threw some at Republican counties, but 95% of it went to Democrat counties. The state of Wyoming, it should have been a simple bill. It should have been very easy. You cannot have private funds used. It's a form of agency capture. If you allow a private entity or corporation or individual to control public services, they will capture those public services and then determine how they are provided to people. You cannot have agency capture. That should have been an easy bill for our legislature to say no Zuckerberg money. It didn't pass. There are other election integrity issues here in the state of Wyoming that should have passed that didn't. We need to be holding our elected officials right here in Wyoming accountable for not addressing those election integrity issues.
Hand-counted ballots.
Yeah.
Pardon me?
Hand-counted ballots. Hand-counted ballots.
Paper ballots.
Well, we got paper.
We have
need
paper,
to go
but
back
no
to
machines.
hand counting and get the machines gone.
So just two more questions. We have to get back on the road tonight. So, and I also want to spend a little time with you if I haven't already answered your questions.
You have not.
Oh, dang. Dang. Okay. I'll come to you as soon as we're done here. Yes, right back there.
Well, I'd be number 2, so
Okay.
I just want to make sure I don't go ahead of someone.
I think that's fine.
In relation to what this gentleman talked about, I was a senior Marine officer and retired about 10 years ago, and I, during my last portion of tenure, we received a survey right after DOMA was repealed. It was right about that time. And the survey indicated, how would you feel if we repealed Don't Ask, Don't Tell? Now I want you to, I'm sure you're able to understand what I'm saying. How would you feel if we repealed Don't Ask, Don't Tell? Don't Ask, Don't Tell was the as you're very familiar with, it was the Clinton initiative that said, you don't ask, we don't ask, you don't tell. And there was, we're talking about senior military officers in the hallway I was in where we were thoroughly confused as to how to answer that. Because our opinion would be, yeah, we should repeal that so that we can ask and be required to tell, to maintain good order and discipline.
But they were going to use your answers differently.
Exactly, and that's precisely what they did. They eliminated an entire section of the UCMJ.
Yeah.
I was not in the position where I could retire, but at that point, I knew personally 4 excellent military officers that retired immediately. Because they recognized that's the end of military, that's the end of military discipline. And you look at where it is now. Okay, so we have actual military members that are not sure what sex they are.
Yeah.
Okay, that would have been unthinkable when I was in. My point is this, and this is leading to a question. You mentioned a parental rights bill for school. Did that include is my child seeking gender affirming
Yes.
care or,
Yes.
okay.
Yes.
Because if it was confusing to a military officer and others that I respected and served in combat with, how much more a
It does.
12-year-old who
It
is
does.
being tricked by this sort of thing?
It does. That's part of it, the privacy issues associated with medical treatment and the, let me see the exact language. This isn't the transparency and accountability for school districts so parents see what is being taught and have ample opportunities to interact with teachers. The right to protect their child's privacy, the right to be updated on any violent activity. But in this, and this is just a summary, this is not what the bill actually says, but what it is to address specifically what you're saying, that school districts cannot be trying to well, it's not a transition. They cannot be trying to mess with these kids' heads and bodies behind the parents' back.
But can we be accurate and call it sex and not gender? Because gender is a linguistic term.
Yeah.
Sex is one,
Yeah.
two, that's it. Can we be
Well,
honest?
and I don't use gender affirming care because that's not what it
It
is.
isn't.
No, it's not care. It's, yes.
First of all, thank you so much for all that you do, but I'm concerned we don't have a year and a half to wait for an election. There's just too many things going, and then are we gonna have a fair election? I don't know what else we can do.
What I can tell you is the folks that I'm working with in Congress, we're trying to fix real live problems. The people I'm working with, and that's why I tell kind of the long story about how the votes for Speaker McCarthy, because I think it's important to understand how aligned we are with each other. Something else to keep in mind about that is that, you know, there was a lot of, I wouldn't say dissension, there was concern because what the Democrats were doing was trying to pick off 5 people, and they only had to pick off 5. So they put together a plan of action in November, I have it, of how they were going to, they identified 5 Republicans in very strong Democrat districts, and they offered them things like chairmanships of committees, freshmen as chairman of the Ag Committee. Those were the kinds of things that they were offering, and they wanted to have they could all agree on a consensus candidate for Speaker of the House. It would have been a disaster. It would have been a disaster. But that was the kind of planning that they were doing. So we only have a 5-person majority. So far, we're hanging together. There are a couple of things. I mean, I voted against continuing to stay in Syria because I think that we've been in some of these places long enough. I also have the same concerns you voiced, which is I don't know that we have the leadership in the military to go win wars. I love our military, and I love our veterans, and I love our military personnel, but I'm not a fan of the leadership. They scare me.
We're not, are we?
Well, compare their aggressiveness to just that of an average Chinese soldier.
Yeah.
And it's sad to say, but they have an aggression that is required. Who do you want at the city gates? You want the meanest guy there.
Right.
And it starts lower than that. I remember I was briefing Charlie Company in 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. The officers all come out of college, and they're all like, well, we can't do this. And the troops are like, let's go kill somebody.
Right.
I mean, God bless the troops.
Yeah.
But the officers are like, oh no, we can't do that. That's not politically correct. And I'm just like, who are you?
No, we've gotten some weird stuff going on, but yeah, I have some concerns about where we are too. We've got to have faith in our system. I will tell you that working back there and working with the people that I go to work every day and I am happy to go to work. I am optimistic because I believe that there are enough people working across this country to change things that we can. In Wisconsin, in Kansas, in Louisiana, in Alabama, in some places in California, in Montana. I really do believe that. But also, I've been reading lately that it's kind of like America every 50 years loses their collective mind. And we're in that 50-year cycle right now. The last one was late 60s, early 70s. Prior to that, it was the 1920s. With Wilson and all of the nonsense of the 16th and 17th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution, creating taking the Senate away from the states, the voting for the appointment of the senators by the states, as well as the creation of the income tax. Prior to that, it was the Civil War. and we make it through, because we have a foundational document called the Constitution that really is one of the greatest documents ever written in the history of the world. One of them, not all of them, but one of them. And it gives us a framework that other countries don't have. They could do what they did in Canada. They can do what they're doing in Canada because they don't have a document that says you can't. And while I sometimes get pretty angry at our judiciary, our judicial system right now, and our judiciary, what they're doing to people like the January 6ers, I also believe that there are judges out there that are going to stop the nonsense, like what you saw in Texas with the judge saying that the abortifacient by the FDA was never properly approved. You've got some people out there who are patriots and who are willing to fight the fight. And there are a lot of people in Congress who are, a lot more than there were 2 years ago and a lot more than there were a year ago. And so I also think that people are educating themselves more. The town halls that I'm having, the number of people who are showing up at these things is amazing. People want to know what's going on. They want to engage. But I'm going to say something else, man. Protect your communities. Protect your fellow citizens. Work to protect your kids. Find out what's going on in your schools. Make sure that it reflects your community and your society and your values, your standards. You don't have to take an answer that, well, no, this is what the federal government tells us to teach. Oh, BS. You can hold people accountable right here. You can, and we need to. That's our form of government, is that it's our representatives here who make the decisions that affect our lives. Let's get back to that by the communities that we work in ourselves. That's what my right. Don't look to the feds, man. I want to take power out of Washington, D.C. We want to bring it back here.
If I could add on to that, what Carrie brought up, I've been a school teacher. I don't currently teach school. I homeschool my kids. But when I was not teaching school, I volunteered to be on the committee to adopt curriculum. I went and requested to be on that committee. They don't really want you all to be on that committee, but I insisted, and I had a great principal that allowed me to. And it was the history curriculum that I selected to be a part of, because I wanted to know which curriculum is teaching accurate history. I mean, we need to talk about slavery so we don't do it again.
Sure.
We need to talk about all these things that are uncomfortable, not pretend that they didn't happen, but we also don't need to shame people today for something our ancestors may or may not have done.
But the reason that we were able to get rid of slavery is because our forefathers created a document that was based upon the individual and based upon freedom and liberty. So slavery was an antithesis to our Constitution from the beginning. It just took a period of time for us to correct that, but we did correct it 150 years ago. The sad part now is we're now going back into slavery because of the policies that are being created by the current administration.
So I want to highlight what you're saying. We can do something about it. We have to get involved. We have to go to school and say, are you adopting curriculum this year? I want to be a part of that committee that adopts the math program, or because they change curriculum, they rotate. Every school does this across the country. Like every 4 years, they rotate curriculum. So be on that committee that decides. And if you don't like, if you think they're all crap, then say none of these are any good.
So one of the things that the previous superintendent of public instruction, she often talked about how she wanted to put into our curriculum the test that is used for immigrants. That you have to pass the U.S. history, that you have to pass that test before you can graduate from high school in Wyoming. And she talked about that and she ran on it, but she never did it. Why don't you demand it? Go call Megan Degenfelder and say, this is something that should be required. Talk to your principal or superintendent here. You shouldn't be able to graduate from high school without knowing that history. I don't think that's a bad idea. But I'll tell you something, I am a constitutional attorney. I'm a water, natural resources, and constitutional attorney. The bar exam anymore doesn't test Constitution. You only have to take 1 semester of constitutional law to get out of law school. Well, you can't understand anything else if you don't understand those foundational documents. Those are the things that scare me. So when I was in law school, I took every constitutional class I could because that's what I always wanted to do. And that's why I'm such a strong advocate for private property rights. If you can't own property, you are property. That again set us apart from so many other countries. You can't take my property without paying me for it. You might be able to take it, but you're gonna have to pay me for it because I own it. And that's why the digital currency and things like that, there are backstops. Even if we're in scary times, there are backstops to prevent them from being able to take away our rights. We have to be vocal about it. We have to be vocal. So, with that, I really thank all of you for being here.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.